All right, we've started ZBrush and we get this box up here that comes up. It's kind of like a promotion media thing, but there's a lot of good information that you can see on their website. They have a lot of tutorials, which is great. I'm not going to use it right now, so I'll just close it. And you'll see this thing up at the top. This is called Lightbox. You can actually just hide it by clicking the Lightbox tab right here, or you can hit hide. If you want to see more stuff, you can hit this right here. But we'll just go ahead and hide this for now. You notice that the document is not kind of using the whole area. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go to my document and hit double. And now I can use more of this area. I like to just zoom it back a little bit. So it's just like just filling the whole area here. And then we'll go ahead and just we'll draw something onto the screen. So you can go into this tool tab here, and there's all kinds of tools. And for instance, I'm going to go ahead and hit sphere. And then if I just left click in the viewport and drag up, a sphere comes out. Okay, now I haven't hit edit yet. So if I clicked again on accident and you know, started dragging up again, you'll see this strange thing happens and it'll just keep drawing stuff out. Well, this is kind of like ZBrush has like a 2D side to it. They call it 2.5D because it actually keeps like depth information. This is sort of that 2D side of it, and we're usually using it for 3D. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this out and then show you how to get started with the 3D. But if you do this, you just hit Control N, so you can clear that out. Left click and drag up, and then just hit edit right away. Okay, so the edit allows you to click outside here and rotate. I'm going to turn on the wireframe so we can see that we're rotating. You can tell what's going on a lot better. If we start off with a sphere like this and we try to sculpt on it, right away it says, you know, convert this 3D primitive to Polymesh 3D by pressing blah, blah, blah. Okay, what does that mean? Well, if we have an actual primitive out, we have a option to go ahead and like change some of the parameters of this primitive by going down to Initialize, and we can go ahead and change like how many edges are in here. We can go ahead and change it this way too. You know, you can see you can change your initial settings. So like, let's say you don't want your sphere to have so much resolution to it. And so, and you know, you can change like you want it skinny or something like that. You know, there's a few different options in here. I typically, you know, I don't have to play with this too much, but I just wanted to show it. The next thing I'm going to do is say make Polymesh 3D, and that's going to make it so it's sculptable. Okay, so if I hit this, make Polymesh 3D, now I have this Polymesh 3D, and if I click on here and just start dragging, you can see this standard brush is just basically it's allowing me to sculpt and push stuff out. Okay, I hit Control Z. I'm just going to undo that. I'm just for good work practices. It's a really good idea to name this whatever name you want it to be. So so you don't get confused, because later if I make another one, it'll have very similar names and it gets very confusing, and it'll have them like in the tool palette. And so I just want to give you good work practices. First thing is I'm just going to call this you know, like test underscore sphere, something like that. Hit enter, and then we have this test sphere. If we, you know, come up to our tools tab here, you can see there's this sphere 3D, and there's this, you know, this is why I was saying it could get confusing, because there's these other spheres here, but this is the one you're actually working on, is the one that's grayed out and it says test sphere. So that's why you want to name it, because that you can see sphere 3D and sphere 3D underscore 1 could be confusing. So sometimes you need to switch between tools in here. But most of the time what I do is I'll basically import tools, or yeah, I guess you'd say they're tools, but you import different meshes really into the same subtool. And basically that's, you can work on, you know, different meshes by clicking on them, and we'll show that in a second. But so we've got this subtool tab, and if I wanted to bring like another sphere in, I would go append, and I can click on this and it brings another sphere in. Okay, so we've got two spheres now, my original and this one, and they're both exactly the same size. So let me go ahead and I'm going to hide this one, but if you note, nothing changed. Well, the reason why is as long as you're clicked on this layer, it's always going to show what you're clicked on. Okay, so if I click on this layer, now all of a sudden you might have noticed there's a little change because I hid this, but I clicked on this other layer, so now it's showing the other one, and I can hide that, but you can see it doesn't change because I'm on that layer. It will not hide it. So the next thing that I want to show is like if I try to sculpt on this, well, when you append it into another, you append a sphere into something that's already created, another subtool, it automatically makes it a poly mesh. So it is sculptable immediately, and you don't have the options in the initialize anymore. Like if I change this, you can see nothing's going to change in that initialize. So I don't have to do anything more to this to make this, like a Polymesh 3D. It's already ready. But being that I did bring in something that looks exactly the same, I am going to rename it for good practices. And I'll call this, I'm going to call this I underscore LFT. So this is the left eye, and hit enter. All right. So if I have this other one unhidden and I've got this one selected, let's say I want to put this where an eyeball would be. Well, I can come up to here and where my edit was, the draw allows me to basically access and do deformations with the brushes. But if I want, I can go to move, and then whatever subtool I have here will allow me to like move. And you'll see now we can see two meshes, okay? Because we have this one, which I can hide, and then we have the one that we're on. All right, so this move tool, also doubles as a scale tool. So if I click in that middle box, I can scale it. I can use these to scale it this way. I'm going to click outside to rotate. So I just left click outside of the mesh to rotate. Or if you want to click over the mesh, you right click to rotate. Okay, so I'm actually right clicking and rotating, but you can also left click and rotate as well, as long as you're outside of the mesh. If you left click over here, you'll see it starts drawing on the mesh. Okay, so this is just the ins and outs of the ZBrush navigation and working that you have to learn. Let's go back to the move tool. Because I'm going to go ahead and you obviously can scale it that way, you can scale it this way, or you can scale it all evenly like this. And then I'm going to go ahead and just rotate like this. I can look at the axes based on this little face right here. So right now, this would be the x-axis because it's pointing that direction. If you pull out the floor, oh, it looks like I'm upside down. No wonder it wasn't working right. So that's why it's a good idea to sometimes pull out the floor and see where you're orientated. Usually you're working in the x-axis like this or like this as far as like getting started. Now that I have this little mesh out here, I'm just going to move it up and I'll scale it down a little bit more. And then I'll rotate this way and I'll move it this way, go like this. Now, if you hold shift, by the way, while you're rotating, it'll start to snap to different angles. Okay, so this is like my front angle. And so it's snapped to that. I can snap to here. And like I want the eyeballs to be in front. So we'll snap it like that. And then I'll show how to move around a little bit more. Okay, from right now, all I've done is rotate, but I just did do a pan. So how do you pan? Okay, well, you have your hand here that will allow the whole canvas to move. So this is it may seem a little confusing, but this down here, the one that says move, actually allows you to move like within. This is basically moving the camera, but just know that this is moving the object, or basically like the camera. This is actually moving the whole canvas. Okay, so that's the one thing to just kind of take note of. All right, so we've got this thing with like this one little eyeball here, and let me rotate it this way. Okay, now if you want to move or pan without touching this right here, you just hold Alt and left click if you're outside of the mesh, and you can hold Alt and right click if you're over a mesh. Like for instance, if I'm over this, I can do it like that. Okay, otherwise if I'm over the mesh and I left click, it doesn't work the same, especially it wants to go back to the draw, which it just did. So you have to Alt right click to pan. Okay, so how do you zoom in and out? It says zoom 3D here, like so. You can just click and drag up and down and you'll zoom in and out. All right, so how do you do that as a shortcut? The way you do that as a shortcut is you start the pan motion where I would press Alt and left or right click, and then I let go of Alt while I'm still holding the left or right click down, and then you can drag up and down and it'll zoom in and out. It's a little bit weird because I don't know any other programs that go use this function. So, but once you get used to it, actually it's not too bad. So basically, yeah, just zoom in and out by holding Alt, starting to move it, and then let go, and then drag up and down, and it'll zoom in and out. Now you may see this is another thing. You may think that this is like zoom, but it's not. What this actually does is zoom in on the canvas, so it actually becomes like all pixelated. So you don't really need to zoom with that. You're actually going to really zoom in 3D, like with this one. So it says zoom 3D. That's the main things that you need to know about navigating. So I'm going to go ahead and hit F. That's another main thing. So F is frame. That's this button right here. And that's a really good thing to know because you'll be doing that a lot. Like for instance, you know, you put in a few different tools, or you want to work on the backside here or something like that. Let's say I hide this, and then if I hit the F again, see, it'll frame that whole thing into my scene. So you can see that that's a great example of where you might want to use the framing, because you don't want to have to keep zooming in and out. You just hit F and it'll zoom you in. Okay, so another thing to know about is like you have a transparency. So if I have both these things, both of these spheres out, and I hit transparency, you'll see what happens. Now you can actually see through, and the one that you're actually working on is not see-through. So that's how that works. Right-clicking, rotate around, you know, look at it from the different angles. If I hold Shift, it'll snap, you know, into these different angles. So I do that a lot too. Like I want to look at it from the front, I'll go ahead and just start rotating and then hold Shift and it snaps. Right now you might note that we're looking in orthographic view, but when we're actually sculpting, most of the time we're going to want to be in perspective view, like so. Okay, so it mimics a perspective camera, and this looks more realistic of what our eyes would actually see. So I use both. There's times where I purposely have the perspective view off, especially if I'm like looking at a reference behind here, which we're not going to go into right now, but you can pull references in here. And like sometimes you want to see the exact reference with in an orthographic view, so you can see if your shape is matching the reference, because if it's in the perspective view, it'll just skew the size of it and stuff like that. So that's pretty important. Another thing that we could get into later, but there's this local symmetry. So if you're working on an object that's like over here, that's not centered in the world, you can hit local symmetry, and what it'll do is go off of the object's like center spot. So in this case, when it's off, we're working off of the world's center spot, or center of the grid. And but we can actually work off of the local if we had other stuff in here. So for instance, this is actually a good example, because if we want to work on local symmetry, I can go ahead and hit this, and then if I'm working on, let's say, this object, and I have the symmetry on, which I'm going to go and turn on right now, transform, and you can see it has activate symmetry, and I'll go ahead and hit that, and it automatically puts up X. You can see it's got symmetry local, but watch what happens if I turn this off. See, it doesn't, my brush is actually it's off on the side. If you kind of look off to the right side of the screen, you'll see it's like jumping around while it's looking for a mesh to deform. If I can still deform this, but it's not going to hit anything because there's nothing over there. So that's where you'd want to use like a local symmetry to kind of do something like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn that off. Another example of like a local symmetry type of thing is that, let's say I want to make the other eye. You know, this is actually, I have left, so let me move this over. Go to the move tool. So I'll move it over to this side because this is where I'd want it. Okay, and I want to make another one. So I'm going to go ahead and just take this, and I'm going to hit duplicate here in the subtool. So we're in the subtool, duplicate, and now right away change the name, rename, and I'll click back here and just put RT, enter. Let's say you want it exactly symmetrical on the other side. The way you can do that, close the subtool, open the geometry, and we're going to go modify topology, and we're going to say mirror and weld. Okay. I don't want the local symmetry on now because it's going to use this center spot. I want it to use the world center spot. So I'm going to go ahead and say, hit mirror and weld. Now it's not going to weld anything because it's not close enough to touch it. And we are actually on our on like our own subtool. So you can see now it actually, the original one's there, and we may think like, well, now I don't really need I don't need this one because of the fact that I have two in here, or you may want them separately so you can work on them separately, and I will show you how to separate these out. Okay, so let's just say, hey, I don't need this one anymore, and I'll go ahead and just hit delete. So I can delete that. Okay, it says it's not reversible, and that is true. It is not reversible. It won't let you do that. So now we have 2 in 1, but we might say, hey, I want a right eye and a left eye. So what we can do is we can go ahead and go to split, and I can go ahead and say split. Which one is it? Let's see if group split works. Say okay. Okay, so because both of these are the same group, which is designated by the color, it won't split them. Okay. So I can do this, but I need to make them separate groups first. And the way you do that is you go down to polygroups and you go auto groups. And so now it should have made, they look so similar, which I don't like when it does that. Let me hit this a few times. It keeps doing like very similar colors. They are different. They may look like they're almost identical, but it basically is changing these. So now if I do this, I'm going to go ahead and say split, group split, say okay, and there you go. Now you can see it did actually split these the way that we wanted. Okay, the grouping is actually important, and that's something we'll get into later, but I use group stuff all the time to like lay out UVs and just, you know, isolate certain parts of something. So it's not something you have to know immediately just to sculpt, but it is something that I use for more technical stuff. So right now, this is the right eye that we're on. So I'm going to go ahead and rename it. Just make sure, well, you know what? I'm going to have to rename the left eye first because I can't name it the same name as this. So I'm going to say, right, get over here to left, LFT, enter, and then this one I can come into and rename this properly. Like I said, it's a really good idea to stay organized with these because ZBrush uses these names and it gets confusing when you don't have them done correctly. So now we have these completely symmetrical, and you know, if I wanted to sculpt on the eyes, I would have left them together in the same tool, or the same subtool, I should say. But because, you know, they're just going to be eyes sitting here that I'm going to build a socket around, I don't mind if they're in separate sections. Okay, that's a little bit more of the interface. Let's talk about, let's get into a little bit more of how we can like import stuff, because what you're probably going to want to end up doing is like bringing a model in from somewhere else. And so we'll go over that. And to do that, when you already have a subtool started like this, you want to append a new piece. So I'm going to hit append, and I usually just append this star because you're not going to confuse this with anything else typically. And you can hide all these other ones, and I'll just have this star out here. I'm going to turn off the frame for now. We can turn off the floor, and now we can just see the star. Remember, hit F, you can frame it. Okay, you want to be on the star as well. Make sure you're not selecting any of these layers. And then you can go into import. I'm going to go import, and I'm going to import this stump. So I'm going to say okay, and boom. This stump, it replaces that star. And this stump was an OBJ that I made for a project, and it was made outside of, well, actually, it technically was made by ZBrush, but I exported it because it was going into Maya. But you can basically export and import OBJs and bring them into other programs and stuff like that, and they'll come in just fine. There's other file formats that you can import and export. I typically always use OBJ. It's the original file that Zbrush was using for 3D files all the way back to at least Zbrush 2, which was like in 2004, 2005 when I started using Zbrush. So I just stick with that. I'm sure there's other file types that work fine too, but I just use the tried and true OBJ. So now I've got this stump in here. You know, I can unhide these if I want. Okay. But now, you know, you can just work on a new object like this. So we can look at the wireframe. You can see it's nice, nice quad wireframe. This is a good wireframe for sculpting on because it's all quads and they're all pretty even. So one of the things to note about ZBrush is that your mesh matters, how your topology is, because if you have really long, stretchy type of geometry, you can run into problems. So I'm going to come back to the original sphere here, and I'll go ahead and show what can happen. Let's just turn this off for a second. And now I'm going to jump to my tablet. I was using my mouse, but I'm going to jump to my tablet, and I'm just going to use the standard brush. Okay, so this is just some concepts. I'm not teaching how to sculpt yet, but I'm just teaching some concepts to know about ZBrush. If I'm sculpting and I've got triangle poles like in the middle here, and I've got kind of long, stretchy geometry, like this is right here. You can see these are like these long, kind of rectangular shapes. I'm going to run into some problems sculpting on that. It's going to look really ugly. So watch what happens here. I'm going to actually use the move tool. So I'm going to hit M on my keyboard after I bring open my brushes. And I'm going to go to the move tool. And I'm going to start moving this. And you can start to see like this gets really ugly. Like you're not going to be able to really get a good shape if you have geometry like this. However, if I'm on the more square geometry and I use the move tool, you can see like how nicely that deforms. Okay, like that's deforming nice and even. However, if I bring it way out, now I've just made these long polygons here again. And if I tried to sculpt on top of these, if I went and pulled these out, now you get into the same realm where you're going to have problems. Okay, well, we have a solution for this. I'm going to undo these. And the solution, actually, let's not undo those. Let's keep this in here. The solution for this would be something like Dynamesh, and that is in the geometry rollout, which is right below the subtools. So Dynamesh, if I open up the Dynamesh, Dynamesh basically will, the way it works underneath the hood is that it puts voxels inside of this and then it basically remeshes the voxels. But all you need to know is that it's going to make like a certain resolution remesh of this with even triangles or polygon or faces, four-sided faces that are sculptable. So let me just hit the Dynamesh button and you can see what happens. Okay, by the way, I don't sculpt with my polyframe on usually, but I'm leaving it on because I want you to see what's happening with the topology. So now we do get triangles, but those are okay for sculpting as long as, you know, we'll fix it into all quads later, but they're fine for sculpting as long as they're kind of like these equilateral triangles, if they're pretty even. And the same thing with the polygons. These are pretty even. So you can see that even up here where we had this weird stretching, now the Dynamesh has basically evened that all out. So I'm going to go ahead and hold Shift on my keyboard, which will let me smooth. So anytime you have any brush and you hold Shift, you'll get a blue brush that'll come out and it will let you smooth. So even though I have the move tool and I can pull this like this, if I hit Shift and go ahead and use the brush, it changes to the smooth brush. Okay, so now you notice like I just stretched this again, and so we can get into the same problem, right? We're getting these really ugly things. Well, to get the Dynamesh to reactivate, I can hold Control swipe outside of the mesh, and then you can see it remeshes it to those even polygons again. Okay, so this is what you can sculpt on this just fine. So if I go back to like my standard brush, or I'm going to use the clay buildup, it's one of the ones that's in the default brushes at the top. I can go ahead and I'll actually turn this off. I can sculpt on this pretty decently. Okay, I will eventually start stretching here and stuff like that, and then I need to remesh it, but I can start sculpting on this pretty decently. All right, we sculpt, smooth a little bit, whatever. If I sculpt and it's like looking really wonky because you're stretching the polygons, you could go ahead and hold control and remesh it, and you can see now that's a lot more balanced. If you want to smooth it out a little bit, you're certainly welcome to. Perfectly fine. So this is something to keep in mind as you're moving along. I'm smoothing right now because you can see the facets. These deformations change the topology, which makes it look etchy, right? And so you need to remesh, and you can see that it'll smooth it out. Okay, that's one way to work. There's actually other methods to work with this too, but I'm starting you off with the most basic way that you're gonna probably work with. I also want to show you that we got all these facets in here. Well, the reason why we got those facets is because when we Dynameshed, the underlying mesh it's actually trying to fill each individual square of the underlying mesh like perfectly as well as it can, and you do get those little squares that were the underlying mesh. I'm going to get rid of those by going to my deformation tab here. So it's kind of down a little bit, over here, deformation. And I'm just going to pull this polish. You can pull it all the way if you want. It's going to really smooth things out. Or you can undo. A little polish goes a long way. So I can just go ahead and put it at like 3 or 2 and see how that looks. So just remember that if you use the polish, there's a bunch of different stuff in here, but we don't have time. We're not going to go through all of it today, but if you want to polish the whole mesh a little bit, just pull it to 1 or 2, and that will smooth a lot of that stuff out. You can see now, you can still kind of see the facets a little bit, so maybe you want to polish it a little bit more, and yeah, now they're gone. So now you've got this nice smoothed out mesh, and you're ready to sculpt. And then as you're sculpting, it's going to pull again, you remesh it, smooth it a little bit, that type of thing with your brush. And this is how you just start moving forward in ZBrush. Okay. So that's some of the basics to understand about just getting started. I haven't gone into like the actual sculpting part, but we'll get into that in the next one.